Campers, this is NPS Ranger News. Our program features the amazing work of National Park Service Rangers, protecting people in parks across the country through law enforcement, search and rescue, emergency medicine, firefighting, and other emergency services. I'm Greg Jackson, your host. NPS Ranger News updates news stories every day as they happen, both on Facebook and Twitter. On Facebook, find us at /NPS Ranger News. On Twitter, we're at NPS_Ranger. Today we're going to talk about the evolution of law enforcement training in the National Park Service. My guest is Cameron Sholly. Cam is currently the Superintendent at Yellowstone National Park. Prior to that, he was Regional Director for the Midwest region. Prior to that, Associate Director for Visitor and Resource Protection. He was the Superintendent of Natchez Trace Parkway. Prior to that, he was the Deputy Associate Director for Visitor and Resource Protection, Special Assistant to the Director, Chief of Ranger Operations in Yosemite. Prior to that, California Highway Patrol in the Bay Area and Central Valley, worked at the Academy in Sacramento as an instructor for the department in DUI and drug recognition. Prior to that, he was a Park Service Ranger. He's gone through seasonal academies, worked as a law enforcement ranger, moved up into supervisory positions. Rather extensive resume, wouldn't you say? My pleasure to introduce Cameron Sholly. Cam?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Appreciate you having me on.
So, Ranger training, where it is and where it's going. Since there have been seasonal park rangers doing law enforcement and there's been law enforcement training, seasonal park rangers have gone to a seasonal law enforcement academy at different schools throughout the country as private citizens, going to on their own time, and paying their own tuition, going to these academies that have been, when I think it was around 6 weeks or so, bumped up to 8 weeks and has kept expanding. And then as the seasonal rangers worked seasonal jobs and then got permanent jobs, the National Park Service sends permanent rangers to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia. It started at 9 weeks and bumped up to 11 weeks and maybe 15, 16 weeks now. Where's that going?
Well, what I'll talk a little bit about is just I know a lot of people kind of share some of these observations over the years in our desire to improve both the quality and the consistency of our law enforcement training across the service. When I went into D.C. as the Associate Director in 2012, especially right after the death of Margaret Anderson, I just found that we really needed to put some focus on improving the quality of training. And there's been a lot of folks over the years that have done a great job of making improvements. But one of the things most concerning to me was the continued disparity between permanent law enforcement ranger training and seasonal law enforcement ranger training. And, we've had 4 rangers killed feloniously in the line of duty in the last 20 years, murdered. Unbelievably, they've all been permanents, but it's only a matter of time before a seasonal ends up getting killed. And we need to do everything possible to make sure that not only for our permanents, but for our seasonals, that we're providing the very best level of training we can. And as you've seen, the seasonals make up an incredible backbone of the Park Service, and we've become, more and more reliant on seasonals as our permanent numbers have declined over time, permanent law enforcement. And so even more of a reason for us to really focus on eliminating that disparity to the best degree possible. I've had the fortune or misfortune, depending on which way you want to look at it, of going through many law enforcement academies, including military police, the Santa Rosa Seasonal Academy, FLETC, the Highway Patrol Academy in California, and the FBI National Academy. And there's a lot of variations in standards across agencies in this country. And the facilities are obviously very different depending on where you go, what agency you're working for, what type of emphasis they put on that kind of core training. When I came in 2012, I really was focused. I think we had 12 or 13 seasonal academies across the country, all trying to do a very good job. All had been very, very good partners for the Park Service over the years, but we were still, I think, sitting at about 280 hours for kind of basic academic seasonal curriculum training with no field training for seasonals. And as you alluded to, we increased our federal permanent training at FLETC substantially over the years. Added field training evaluation back in 2003 and 4. And so we've come a long way when it comes to the permanent ranks, but we've basically stalled out and have been in a stall for a long period of time with the seasonals. I think that disparity between permanent and seasonals, when you included FTEP, had grown to somewhere about 600-700 hours difference in training. I just found that completely unacceptable. When you look at policy and we talk about quote-unquote type 2 limited commissions, we're only talking about serving warrants outside of parks and, conducting complex felony investigations. Most seasonals out there, I would say, and myself included early on, did conduct complex felony investigations. The seasonals operate, generally speaking, with full authority. So it's really a commission that's not that limited. And there's an expectation by the public, if they see a season, they don't know the difference between a seasonal and a permanent. So they're going to expect, and we should expect, that a seasonal is every bit as capable of handling any type of incident as a permanent full-time Type 1 commission ranger. I mean, that's just a fact. And the reality is that the seasonals are out there on the ground, equally exposed, in some cases more exposed to the dangers of this profession than the permanents. And so they're seeing the same things, they're dealing with the same things, and it's derelict on our part to not do everything possible to eliminate that disparity to the best degree possible.
Okay. Let me go through a couple of acronyms. First is FTEP, which is the Field Training and Evaluation Program. So for folks, permanent rangers, if you're a seasonal ranger, you get hired on permanent, go to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, and then it's off to field training in a designated park throughout one of the designated parks throughout the country. So it's academy training and field training for permanent rangers, not so much for seasonal rangers. And then a Type 2 commission, and this is a vestige of, it goes back, it's still there. It's on the books. There are commission in the National Park Service is your document that says you are a law enforcement officer. Other agencies will call it a delegation. It's a document delegating law enforcement authority from. It starts with the Secretary of Interior, goes to the Director of the Park Service, and ends up delegated to the seasonal ranger who's out actually arresting people. So within the Park Service, there are seasonal commissions, Type 2 commissions, and permanent commissions, Type 1 commissions. They both have arrest authority, but there's some stipulations put on the seasonal commission, which, again, if somebody's being arrested, they don't really care too much about it, and it's more of a procedural thing than anything else. But it seems a bit archaic, and I don't know if the people who came up with reasons for that. I remember I talked to one of the people who helped put that together, and it was one of it was an administrative reason that at the end of the season, if a seasonal is investigating, stumbles upon a murder, and starts investigating that, they didn't want to have to bring the seasonal back after the end of the season when they're no longer an employee to deal with a murder case. It's like, well, okay, I understand that, but anyway, that's my explanation of some of the terms that were covered there.
Yeah, I think for me, having been a peace officer in California, I think arguably California's got one of the highest state peace officer standards in the country, and every peace officer in California goes through a 6-month academy to get a basic, what they call post-academy certificate, peace officer standards and training, which makes them eligible to become a California state peace officer. And the vast majority, if I kind of look at our seasonal cadre in the Park Service as analogous to a reserve officers corps. And a lot of agencies across the country have a group of, if you look at, pick a city on the East Coast like Ocean City, or you could look at Long Beach, or you could look at all kinds of different places where there's a large seasonal influx of visitors or tourist population increases that may last 3 or 4 months, similar to our seasonal needs in the Park Service, they have to supplement their kind of permanent peace officer workforce with qualified, sometimes, like I said, reserve or temporary officers that can help, handle the workloads and the demands that are put on at various times of the year by increased populations. I think that, there's a lot of questions that have come up about how we use seasonals and that kind of thing. And the reality is I don't see us ever getting out of a need to have seasonal law enforcement across this country. It's just the parks, the budget situation, the seasonality of the parks visitation requires us to have seasonal workforce, whether that's in law enforcement or whether that's in any number of other disciplines where we heavily depend on seasonals. In Yellowstone, we have 400 or 500 seasonals per year. The supplemental permanent workforce of about 350. So we have more seasonals than we do permanents. And like I said, I don't care if it's law enforcement or maintenance or interpretation, education, resource management. They play a very critical role in our success, and it's important that we do everything possible to build their acumen and their competencies so they can go out there and perform in the way that we need them to, so we can succeed, whether that's in Yellowstone or anywhere across the country. Law enforcement's a little bit different from the standpoint of the types of qualifications and the types of expectations that we need to have and that we need to provide to the best degree possible for our workforce. And so I say that from the standpoint, back on the reserve officer analogy, when you had, like I said, back in 2012 when I went in, 12 or 13 seasonal academies that were generally speaking operating off the same 280-hour curriculum, but there was massive variances in who was doing the instructing of those topics, the types of infrastructure that a particular quote-unquote academy might have. I heard some horror stories of, one academy's definition of high-speed driving training was, renting Hertz rental cars, front-wheel drive, doing cone courses in parking lots. We're better than that. And so one of the things we first and foremost looked at was a criteria that we felt was necessary, kind of a minimum standard for which we would consider a seasonal academy as qualified for training our seasonal law enforcement workforce. And when we went out and did the reviews and evaluations of these different academies, we, no surprise, found a large number that weren't meeting those standards. We gave them opportunities to meet the standards. Some of them stepped up and did it. Some of them decided to go a different direction. But I think we ended up with 5 or 6. I don't know exact number we have right this second. But, my viewpoint is that I would rather have less less academies with higher quality, a better way for us to provide oversight and partnership with those academies than have 12 or 13 kind of running on their own program and an inability for us to actually provide the expertise and guidance and support to some of those academies. And so we kind of whittled down from the 12 to 13 to the number that we have now. And then we required, one of the requirements was that the remaining seasonal academies elevate their academic curriculums to the best degree possible to mirror the FLETC academic curriculum. And part of that was, once again, just working to eliminate the disparity between what a permanent ranger gets at FLETC in academics and what a seasonal ranger gets at a seasonal academy in academics, and our ability to make sure that both of those permanent and seasonal employees were coming out, generally speaking, with the same level of curriculum focus in the right areas, the right levels of quality of instruction, the right training environment. So they were better trained and better capable of handling mission demands once they got to their assignments.
Okay, so going to where things were traditionally, the seasonal academy was an abbreviated academy. A person who wanted to be a seasonal ranger would put themselves through this abbreviated academy, apply for a ranger job, get hired, work as a seasonal with this abbreviated training, get some 40-hour refresher season after season. After a few years, get hired as permanent. And then generally there was a waiting period between getting hired as permanent and would have to wait 1 year, 2 years and change to get a training slot at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, and then off for a few months to training, then off for a few months to field training. So basically this person between their first date hired as a seasonal park ranger may go 1 to 3 years as a seasonal and 2 years as a permanent before finally getting to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. So they'd be working in a law enforcement job, getting successful performance evaluations year after year, being able to handcuff, being able to qualify and shoot and drive and fill out reports and all kinds of stuff. And I've seen people, my background, just fair warning for everybody who should know. Cam was my second line supervisor for years when I have supervised the basic training program for the National Park Service, the field training program for the National Park Service, seasonal training program for the National Park Service, and advanced training. So full transparency here. I've seen prior seasonals come in that have been permanents into the field training program that have been with the agency for 10 years. Doing law enforcement, and now we're sending them, or now the agency, the Park Service was sending them off to finally getting to field training. Now things have changed where it's a little bit more training is loaded more up front.
Well, yes and no. I mean, we still have this massive wait list that we've always had, although we did, as you probably recall, in 2007, we got the waiting list at FLETC down to, we reduced the backlog from like 111 rangers that were waiting to get into FLETC down to 7. And we were actually able to do what we should be doing, which is, in essence, as soon as someone's hired permanently, basically immediately give them a FLETC assignment or slot. The agency is, I don't know how I want to say this, but it's screwed up. Our system's totally screwed up, and it's backwards. I mean, if I look at my testing process with the Highway Patrol in California, it was a 1.5-year testing process. It was, most agencies, there's no way that you would get hired necessarily and then get put on a 2-year waiting list to get into the academy. And at the same time, then you're out basically performing full performance law enforcement duties as a seasonal. We've been unable to break ourselves out of this cycle. And the irony of the 2007, when we got the waiting list down to such a small number, was parks are used to hiring someone into a permanent position and it taking them 2 to 3 years to get to FLETC. And they've kind of like counted on that time to keep people in the park. And so it's like, hey, Greg, I'm hiring you. Congratulations, you're permanent, and we'll get you to FLETC when we can. But in the meantime, you're hanging out here. Because once you go to FLETC, then you're marketable. So you may go off and get a job somewhere else, and I don't want that to happen. So we actually experienced a substantial amount of pushback from parks, various parks across the country, when we started assigning FLETC spots right off the bat. And they're like, whoa, isn't this supposed to take a little while? Well, you
Sure.
can't have it both ways. And the way that we've been in is not working.
No.
So back on the seasonals, like I said, we're in a situation with those seasonals, like I said, where they're being put in, like I said, the same dangerous situations as permanents. There's like an expectation by the public that they're going to perform equally to any peace officer in the state, any peace officer in the country. Definitely going to be equivalent to someone sitting in the same uniform side by side who happens to be a permanent. And so we've got to do better there. And I think that, you know, one of the pushbacks that I got as AD years ago on this whole thing was we're putting an undue burden on the seasonals in regards to them having to pay more money to go through seasonal academies, spend more time, kind of an undue burden on some of the academies themselves at expanding the curriculums, and all that comes with that as far as more instructors and things like that. And what I would say is that a good excuse? I mean, is that a good reason? I mean, we're not fixing the FLETC situation anytime soon. FLETC is a great academy. It's a great campus. I would not say that it's the creme de la creme of law enforcement academies. I mean, it's good. But I think we also have some very, very good academies like Southwestern, Santa Rosa, they themselves train beyond Rangers, peace officers for the state of, say, for instance, Santa Rosa, that's a junior college, that's a California post-certified academy. And so, you know, in California, for instance, people that want a job with a department, I mean, I think the only 3 law enforcement agencies in the entire state of California that have their own academies are, I believe, CHP, LASO, and LAPD. If you want to be a peace officer in any other entity or any other organization, you've got one of 2 options. You get hired on, and they'll sponsor you through one of these junior college police academies, like Santa Rosa, or you put yourself through, just like you would any kind of vocational certificate or, you know, putting yourself through college or something like that. And once you get that post-certificate, then you're marketable to get hired on by an agency permanently in that state. And I think the seasonal academy model for us moving forward, in my mind, is that we'll never. I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form we need to get away from using FLETC. I think we need to continue to be a great partner with FLETC, and we need to utilize FLETC to the best degree possible. What I'm saying is, I think there are 2 or 3 academies that are high quality enough and train peace officers outside of the Park Service and have a proven track record and have a demonstrated interest in improving their curriculums to match FLETC's, that ultimately you could have a situation where a seasonal going into putting themselves through Santa Rosa comes out and they don't necessarily need to go back through FLETC. I mean, here we are spending, you know, $30,000-$35,000 per person to send them through FLETC 2 or 3 years later. They're already putting themselves through seasonal academies. Yes, now it's a longer seasonal academy, but if we've done our jobs right and we have the right oversight on a limited number of qualified academies, I believe that we can have FLETC as an option. We could have some of these other academies that have met the standards as an option. And, you know, there's also ways we can pay, like someone puts themselves through a seasonal academy and acquires school loans. Once they get hired, you know, we already have existing authorities to pay those school loans off. So there are ways that we can help alleviate some of those financial burdens. But those aren't anything different than officers in state agencies that put themselves through, or candidates, I should say, that put themselves through their own academy hoping that they'll get a job once they graduate. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I can think of an example for that within the Park Service, is what I helped do in part of it, and good part of it was under your watch, with the special agent in the National Park Service. And to explain special agent training is most special agents in the Park Service get hired. They're former Rangers. So as former Rangers, they're more former permanent Rangers. So they'll have put themselves through a seasonal academy, worked as a seasonal, then gotten a permanent job with the National Park Service and gone through the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, FLETC, has gone through the Ranger Academy, and then they would get hired as a special agent. And then they would go through yet another academy at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, the CITP, Criminal Investigator Training Program. And half of that was basic training, where you learn how to handcuff, that you've been doing for 10 years already. You learn how to write a report that you've been doing for 10 years already. You learn how to drive that you've been doing for 10 years already. And we took that and we cut that back. We cut it a ways back. The skills that were already there on the job, we took out a lot of basic handcuffing and a lot of basic defensive tactics and a lot of basic firearms, and pared it back. And that's been going, I think the number of class hours got cut back 50%. And that's been running for long since it's been. I've been retired for 5 years now, and maybe a little bit longer. And I don't know if there's any complaints coming out of that or not, but the program's still there.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I mean, we've come a long way, and you played a big part of this in improving our policies in the agency. Our law enforcement policies are, I think, really good compared to what they were previously. They've evolved substantially. I mean, there's obviously arguments that there's too much policy and that kind of thing, but in today's day and age, it's important that we have very good quality policy, and I think we've made substantial strides in that area. We've made incredible strides, I think, in improving the equipment and training in a variety of different areas. And there's always room for improvement, but I just look at this assignment I'm in now. There's an incredible group of law enforcement, public safety folks up in Yellowstone. They've got outstanding equipment. We're working to support them even more. They've got a lot of things to do from the standpoint of how we progressively look at deployment of our resources and making sure that our resources are communicating and collaborating across district boundaries and all the things that any organization deals with. But generally speaking, when I look at how a ranger's trained, equipped today, it's substantially better than it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago or longer, obviously. And so I think we have made some really good improvements. I do believe that there's still considerable room for improvement in relationship to advanced training, what we provide at the national level, how we help support parks and providing some of the more progressive types of refresher training for both permanents and seasonals, that type of thing. But so I don't want to paint a picture that we haven't come a long way, because I do believe we have. But this is an area that I really think we still need to continue to focus on and not lose momentum on as we move forward.
All right, with changes this big, there's bound to be, the Park Service is not known for embracing change rapidly, more of an evolutionary thing, and it's always a bit of concern. And some of the concerns I've seen brought forward regarding this, one you've already addressed, is the cost to the student. 12-week academy is more expensive than a 6-week academy. And that will, of course, affect the demographics of the potential applicants who will decide to take on a longer academy. How is that going to work out in your vision?
Well, first and foremost, what's the alternative? That we have 13 academies that are cheaper but completely inconsistent. So I think there's a balance in there somewhere. I do think that some of these academies have, like Silva, I know Southwestern has managed, even with this increased curriculum, to keep their tuition costs very reasonable. And they've done a very, very good job there. I know costs have gone up like you said, if you're going to go from a 6-week academy to a 12-week academy, there's clearly going to be an increase in cost to the overhead of the academy, to the operations of the academy, and a lot of that's passed on through tuition to the students. But I think there's ways that we can work through that. And clearly, I'm not in D.C. right now, and there's some good folks, obviously, in Wausau and at FLETC, looking at these types of things. But I wouldn't rule out some time downstream where we can come up with some more sophisticated ways of I'll just use the word subsidizing, but helping whatever that smaller core approved academy looks like. We're spending, like I said, well, at least when I left, I think we were spending $30,000 to $35,000 per student to go through basic and field training. And when you times that out, times the number of folks that we put through every year, it's a lot of money. And are there ways that we haven't thought of yet that if we did get, I don't want people to go ballistic on me here or anything like that, but is there mechanisms that once we get a very smaller core approved grouping of academies for which we can help offset some of those costs one way or the other, so those tuition costs can go back down? Or are there ways, like I said, that we can be creative in relationship to helping graduates pay off any loans or that type of thing that they've accumulated going through those academies? But the one thing that isn't a good thing to do is to say it's now too expensive now, so let's go back to a free-for-all kind of approach so we can lower costs, even if it means we're going to be inconsistent and lessen the quality of the training. That's just completely unacceptable in my mind. Okay,
and quality control is a concern that you've addressed somewhat, but to address it in even greater detail, if the Park Service is saving $35,000 per employee, law enforcement employee, by not sending them to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, and they send 100 to 150 to 200 or more a year, that's a significant savings. How much of that I'm not asking for a dollar amount, but what percentage or how much should be reinvested into quality control of the seasonal academies that are now they're going to be the primary academies? How much should be reinvested into that, and what should the standard be for quality?
Well, first of all, I don't think we're training 150 to 200 a year at FLETC in basic. I think it's much less than that. I don't know what the exact number is. I can't remember, but I do think that the FLETC budget needs to be increased, and I do think that there needs to be a look at, as we evolve with some of this kind of new paradigm that hopefully we're moving toward, that monies that we would have traditionally spent in certain areas over the years that we perhaps have recovered through kind of this new model, which obviously we're not there yet, but I think as we progress, I think you really do have to do an analysis of how do we best provide the support to our approved academies. And that's, to me, you're going to put an NPS rep on the ground with those academies to provide oversight and partnership with the academies in moving NPS cohorts through. And like I said, I think there's also some room to explore where can we look creatively at other ways to help these academies offset costs and share some of that responsibility with them, because they've got to cover their costs. They've got to be in a business model that makes sense for them, and we're getting hopefully a benefit out of that also. And I don't want to be in a situation where we're trying to put the entire Park Service training budget responsibility on the shoulders of seasonal employees trying to get a law enforcement credential or qualification. And so that there's a balance in there somewhere. And I would also be interesting to know, like I said, Southwestern's managed to keep their costs very low. I know other academies have gone up. Where are some? How are some academies keeping their costs lower while others are going much higher? And are there ways that we can provide support to even that out a little bit? Like I said, so that burden's not necessarily on the shoulders of the seasonal students per se, at least fully, and that we're continuing to provide the right level of partnership to make sure we've got a sustainable path forward with whatever number of academies that we end up finally approving.
An important part of basic training, besides the academy, is field training. And in the historic mix, there was no field training, and then there was a field training program put in after FLETC. So a seasonal ranger goes to a seasonal academy, works a few seasons as a seasonal, gets a permanent job, works a year or two as a permanent, goes to FLETC, and finally is off to field training to learn the job they've been doing for the last few years. And come to find out, a certain percentage, small percentage, but a significant percentage, of people who go through field training would not pass. And this is especially tragic for those folks who didn't pass, because they've been doing the job for a number of years. They have a lot of time invested in the agency, as opposed to someone who may have gone in their first year on the job and didn't make it. That's tragic enough, but doing it 5 years, it creates a whole lot of problems up and down the line. Where do you see field training fitting into this mix as things evolve?
Well, I think that's another area the agency progressed substantially on after 2003, and at least implementing a field training program for permanents. To my point earlier, where you've got 400 or 500 seasonals. I think there's 400 or 500 seasonal law enforcement rangers in the agency, and then last count I think was 1,200 or 1,300, give or take, level 1 permanent commissions. Now, that includes chief rangers and others. So your ability to have enough certified permanent level 1 commission field training rangers to train permanents alone has been strained, and something we've struggled with over the years, let alone moving seasonals into that mix. And that's going to be something we've come a ways with some of the requirements, at least on a smaller scale, for field training for seasonals, or whatever you want to call it. It's not a full-blown field training program for seasonals, but at least the seasonals are getting something now compared to what they were getting before. I think that's a bigger conversation in relationship to how we ensure that we've got the right staffing to workload ratios, both so we have a viable field training program for permanents and for seasonals that are going through. And I think there's a question there, for seasonals. Obviously, if you have a seasonal that comes in year one and sticks around for 5 years, that's a good return on investment. It's worth our time. I think the struggle is we need to provide the same field training for a seasonal that comes in for 1 year, but that's especially in some of these parks that don't have a large number of permanents, that can be challenging. So what's the needle to thread, so to speak, in relationship to how we provide some level of quality field training for seasonals and make sure that it's commensurate with our permanent staffing capabilities to actually provide it? That's a question that's, I think, not answered quite yet.
Okay. Yeah, it's complicated because for those that are not familiar with the Park Service, Cam mentions numbers and puts qualifiers on numbers. I brought up numbers, and he said those numbers aren't valid. Things have changed over the decades, where the workforce changes in size on a daily basis. There are people coming and going, and one season's, it just depends on the budget and hiring authorities. And in some years, there are many more seasonal rangers than others. There are many more permanent rangers than others. And getting, I said 1 year there was 200 and some rangers went through FLETC. It was before field training, but it was like the benchmark year. I remember it as 214 or something magic number like that, and they had to just run a ton of classes. Other years in the double digits were 60, 80 slow. It's really tough to manage a workforce where you have to forecast things years in advance when there are surges like that, and trying to decrease the number of people waiting for training is a special challenge. And the field training program is traditionally a bottleneck in National Park Service law enforcement training. The Federal Law Enforcement Training Center itself deals with a lot of agencies, and one can put a bunch of classrooms. They've put up temporary buildings, and they surged, and they're very good at accommodating a surge. The National Park Service field training program is run by the National Park Service in national parks, and it's tough. One can't really build new houses in national parks to house new trainees or new instructors, and it's extremely complicated to try and deal with even a small percentage increase and decrease from year to year. So solving the problem is going to be a challenge. Getting people seasonals through field training. Do you see it as a get hired as a seasonal, go through a phase 1 field training your first season, phase 2 your second season, and then people are getting permanent jobs now after a couple of 3 years, having a more extensive, maybe a bit of an academy as one gets a permanent job to ultimate quality control, and maybe get into some higher skills to allow people to move up a supervisory chain a bit, and then do a bit of field training beyond that. See it more, or do you see it all being front loaded into the seasonal ranks, or front load? Where's it all going to work out on a time frame?
Well, I really do encourage you to talk to the superintendent of FLETC, and perhaps the field training manager down there now, and even the basic program manager, and get some more contemporary viewpoints. I mean, I really focused on kind of why we started down this path, now 7 years ago. I think you bring up a good question. First and foremost, is there a way for us, the field training program for permanents has been voluntary on the part of parks. And so we've set up a structure that's worked, and largely because of the dedication of a lot of the chief rangers out there and field training rangers who have really strived to, they understand the importance of the role of the field training officer, and how getting people trained up front and doing that evaluation on them and helping them and it really serves as a foundation for the rest of their career. So our inability to do that well up front has longer-term ramifications. So I think there's some things that need to be looked at in relationship to how we better incentivize parks to play the role that they need to in participating in field training. Some of those parks is easier than others, depending on what their staffing levels are. It's a slippery slope with field training with seasonals if you start saying, let's sequence it over years, because, one of the primary reason to have field training is to take what a person learns in the academic environment and see how they actually apply that in real life and under real life stressors and conditions that are much more difficult than perhaps sitting at in a classroom and taking a test or taking a test in a controlled environment at an academy. And so I think that liability-wise, we've got to figure out a way to have the right numbers of field trainers in place to handle as best that we can the number of new hires that come into a particular area. And I think for us, it's just another area that we're backwards in. If I look at my CHP experience, I'd been a level 1 supervisor in the Park Service. I'd been to FLETC. That didn't matter. CHP wasn't going to sign off. I had made literally hundreds of arrests in the Park Service before I ever went to the Highway Patrol in California, and they didn't care about that. and they weren't going to sign off on me early just because I had a bunch of previous law enforcement experience. Now, that may be an extreme there. We've adopted the San Jose model, which is, as most people know in the law enforcement community, kind of the standard in field training, and it's very structured. It's been litigated numerous times and defended successfully. And so when you start tinkering with time frames and things like that, you end up watering down, I think, that defensibility, one, and more importantly, two, you start watering down the type of field training quality that you want to see given to these new employees coming into the organization. Now, that said, I do believe because of the large dependence on seasonals and the limited number of permanent field training rangers that we have who are also training permanent field training, that we're going to have to perhaps look at something. I mean, do we want to have a situation where we say no field training for seasonals like we were before, or an extremely watered down version just so we can say we did it? That's not where we want to be. But on the other hand, is there some flexibility in there to where we can maintain the integrity of the San Jose model, and perhaps where, someone has shown an ability to get 4s on every single DOR in a certain number of phases, they can get signed off, or if they've been through a field training program, equivalent program before in a different agency, that maybe there's an abbreviated program that we can use. I know there's some thoughts about that. I think there's some things you can look at there, but there's repercussions on either way that you go, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And two things I need to explain to folks who may not have a Park Service background. Cam mentioned that the field training program is voluntary in some parks. He means for the parks to participate, the trainees have to go to one. But
right.
For a park to host it, such as, we'll use Yellowstone, it's through the good grace of Yellowstone to host that park. They could say we're not doing it anymore because it's a burden placed on the staff there. Yes, there's some benefits that go with it, but the expense and the time and the effort falls largely upon the park to accommodate the field training program. There are some benefits, but it's from just a time and dollars and cents point. The park is facing that. So some parks have chosen, especially in times of financial problems or staffing needs, where they've just have lost staff. They can't accommodate it anymore. So that's what the voluntary component of that is. And then we'll go to the glossary here for a DOR. If someone is getting a good DOR, a daily observation report, if they're doing well, then if they're meeting the standards, then I think what you're getting at is then maybe we don't need to be repetitive. And I think that's part of what we're getting now is not being repetitive in training, not having repeating handcuffing again.
Yeah, I mean, you've got seasonals that, like you said, had 5-10 years of experience, have worked in high volume areas that actually have more experience than their field training ranger. And that's a fact. And, while I'm all about adhering to the time frames, on that daily observation report, if it hasn't changed since I've been in law enforcement, which has been a while, one was the totally unsatisfactory side of things, and 7 was, you walk on water. You need 4 in every category that's rated in order to get off of field training after the appropriate number of phases. And I think that while there needs to be a minimum requirement, and there's going to be all kinds of people that are in law enforcement that would say this is a stupid idea, and then maybe it is. And I'm not saying this is the way we need to go, but I think we need to be looking at some of this. We're bringing people into the organization that already have years and years and years of law enforcement experience, and then we're putting them through a field training structure that was designed for people who've never been in law enforcement for the most part. And so my point is there a happy medium somewhere where if you've got somebody that has multiple years of experience and you're evaluating them and they're getting level 4 in every single category or higher, do you just go ahead and keep them on for the next 2 or 3 phases just to keep? I don't know. I mean, at what point do you allow someone to get signed off on? And is, maybe there's a I know this is a slippery slope and this would be hard to do, but if I take a Greg Jackson who comes on permanent in Yellowstone after being seasonal for 10 years in Yellowstone, does he need to go through 4 phases of field training versus somebody who we hire who's never worked law enforcement in their life? I don't know what that looks like. Or if we lateral someone in from, the deputy sheriff comes in as a ranger, or a BLM commission ranger comes over to the Park Service with a lot of experience. I just feel like we're kind of in this. We want to hold the standard, and we should, and we've got to be really careful, like I said, not to hurt the integrity of the field training program. We still want defensibility and we want high quality, but at the same time, the very nature of that structure and the way that we're structured is preventing us, I think, from doing that as robustly as we possibly can.
Okay. Let me bring up an issue that it's how parks are going to have to adjust their train of thought as this situation would evolve. A large number of permanent rangers that go through basic training at FLETC and through field training come from I forget the number, but it's near 40, 30, a big bite of that group, a big slice of the pie, come from a handful of parks that tend to hire all the permanent employees. Or a majority or a big chunk of the permanent employees come from some very large parks. Some other parks never hire a new employee. They hire people who have worked at other parks, and they've never had to send their employees to FLETC. Now, under the way this evolves for training front loads, the good news for those parks that have been paying their employees to go to FLETC and field training, they're not going to have to do that anymore. So that would be good news for them. I see them supporting that. The other side of the coin is parks that have hired seasonal employees are going to get better trained seasonals, but they're going to have to, those people can't go to work the first day. They're going to have to go through a more substantial field training program, and not all parks hire seasonal employees. How is that going to have to be sold to superintendents and others?
Well, I think that's a great question. I mean, especially where, you have a park that say has 2 or 3 permanent rangers, like pick a small unit somewhere, and they hire, 3 seasonal law enforcement rangers, and the seasonals may actually outnumber the number of permanents. I don't know what the answer to that is, and I think that that's something that needs to be thought through. I mean, right now, how's that working? And are there there's probably there's probably not one single answer that solves it. There's probably nothing that solves it perfectly. And I would continue to say that we as an agency need to evolve in how we look at that and how we support parks in relationship to the policies that we implement, and do they have the actual tools and capacity to implement the policy successfully? Or do those policies, by their nature, are they so restrictive that a park has no choice but not to hire seasonal law enforcement? And, I think there's got to be, there's a better way of doing it, there's no question. The way we were doing it, while easier, I think we can all agree was probably not the best course of action for the future. And I don't know exactly some of these variables that we deal with in the structure that we've created are not easily solvable, but I think that's something that definitely needs to be looked at, because there are so many parks that don't necessarily have the permanent staff load, even in the big parks, quite frankly, to train all of their seasonals or all of their new permanents.
Sure. And, we mentioned how some field training parks would boycott, for lack of a better word, or just jump out of the program because of the time and the effort and the expense, and they're just not able to help at that point. But
we looked at, as you recall, we looked at should there be some type of financial assist to parks to incentivize their participation in field training vis-a-vis any number of different things. Could be, we give them money for 5 GS9 field training rangers and that money's maybe controlled by Washington, but they control the FTE or the positions. We looked at a couple of different things like that. I mean, that's a slippery slope too, because what's the balance in who's doing the hiring? Are they hiring the right people? What's the management structure in that particular park? Are they able to actually retain those field training rangers? Do they have housing for field training rangers? I mean, there's a lot of things there, but I do believe that there being some type of incentive for parks not only to participate. I mean, you can't require participation for a park that doesn't have capacity to actually do the task.
Sure.
And so I think in the majority of parks are trying to make it work to the best degree possible. We see all kinds of great configurations where, 2 or 3 parks in the same kind of general geographic, they may not each individually have enough field training rangers to train, but combined, they move the phases around from park to park and it works out. I think obviously the big parks have worked to create a solid cadre of field training rangers that can be used to, up till now, or up till recently, train permanents. But what does that capacity need to look like if we want to make some more of these bigger shifts? And where's the cost benefit of someone that comes on for 3 months? And I think there's some modeling out there that we can do with some of these other, like these reserve programs across the country. But what's the cost benefit of a seasonal that's going to work, one season for 3 or 4 months, and we train them majority of their first seasons in field training, so to speak, and then they're gone. And how do we deal with that? I think that's a good question.
Yeah, I agree. There's a couple of scenarios. One is going back to the field training parks and having to eat expenses. The high volume hiring parks, they have to eat expenses too. Pick one of the parks that hires a bunch of permanent rangers each year, and they can't opt out. They have to hire people. They can't say, we're not going to be an intake park anymore, because they need to hire employees. So they can't opt out of that, and they've been eating those expenses for years. On the other hand, and what you were getting to, there's a park like I used to work at Bryce Canyon. And a typical Bryce Canyon seasonal, it's their first season in the Park Service. It's a late season, so they'll start right about now. It gets earlier every year, but there's still snow on the ground there. And so right around Memorial Day, they'll come in. They'll work through Labor Day. And they may do that for 2 seasons before they move to another park. So if I'm the chief ranger of Bryce Canyon, I'm going to have to pay out of my park budget a person to seasonally train someone. Is that just, one solution to me is, because the funding is compartmentalized, where this park has some money, this park has some money, is going to more of a fire pro model where law enforcement training and hiring and seasonals in one big pool of money, so people aren't having to play tug of war with that. Is that one way to go?
I like how you worked that question into this. I think that there's some value in centralized hiring processes, no question. I will tell you, in the Fire Pro model, if the FMO in Yellowstone, even though he's funded out of fire, leaves tomorrow, the park still hires that position. And so it's not like we just get, a group of firefighters that someone else chooses into Yellowstone, for instance. So I think there's probably a hybrid. I think that there's a structure that needs to be set up that's conducive for alleviating some of those training and administrative burdens on the parks and providing them with hopefully well-qualified or already qualified people to put into some of these jobs. But I don't foresee, I wouldn't support a system that was completely centralized and where a park just, 2 new rangers just showed up without any say-so in the park. And I don't think that's what you were saying, but I think that there's a substantial amount of room for improvement for that pendulum to swing back to where we have more of an organized, and I'll use the term centralized, even though I don't mean fully, approach to hiring and some of the offsets that come with hiring. But I still think the parks need to have a say-so in who comes to a particular park, because there are a lot of different skill sets that parks need that may be different from park to park, and they should have an ability to have some influence on the types of people and the types of skill sets that they're trying to attract. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I think of the NFL draft really is as a model where everybody's going to the NFL, but there's some cooperation and coordination, and teams are allowed to trade players and they have their own interests at hand. But in the big picture, there's cooperation where everybody's going to get a certain number of players, and the trick is getting people to embrace similar goals.
Well, I use CHP as an example of what you're talking about on the extreme of centralized hiring. I mean, every officer that shows up brand new into an area office after graduation from the academy, that the operating budget of that particular area hasn't spent a dime on the officer getting to that point, whether it be in the written test, the psychological test, the medical evaluation, the BI, the academy. They basically have a minimum staffing level in, East LA or South San Francisco or North Sacramento, or pick an office in California. And, let's say that minimum staffing level is 50 officers for a particular area, and they go down to 45 due to retirements or transfers. So they've got 5 available slots. Those first 5 available slots are available to, first and foremost, anybody in the state that wants to transfer to that office. So that's where they look first. Does anyone want to come to North Sacramento? Because we've got 5 slots open. And they put out a transfer list, and people say no or yes, and say 2 people transfer, so now there's 3 slots. And they may take 3 graduates out of the academy to fill those 3 slots. Now, when those 3 people come in, they require field training, and depending on what area office you're in, there may or may not be if an area like South Los Angeles or San Jose, their attrition is so high, they have a substantial number of field training officers already trained. In some of the more coveted parts of the state, where you don't see a lot of new officer transfers out of the academy, they may not have a substantial number of field training officers. And if they do get new field training officers or new graduates, then sometimes they've got to ramp up their capacity in field training, either send people to get recertified, or they've got to send them to a different area to get trained before they get assigned permanently. And so, but my point is that an individual area in the CHP there's not a dime spent on the officer up to the point where they walk in the door, and it's easier maybe in that organization because everybody's trained through the same academy, everybody goes through the same process, their structure's set up to manage that way. We're kind of reverse here, and so while we might want to think about a day where we can be a little bit more centralized like that, what are the steps that we need to take to get to that point? And I'm not sure what that looks like exactly, but I also, back on what I said earlier, a ranger you might want to work in Yosemite Valley, where you want maybe some high-angle rescue experience, or you want them to be a paramedic, or you want them to have some special skill sets, may be very different than a ranger that you're looking at for, pick an urban area. And you don't so there has to be an ability. I mean, I can be a CHP officer and show up in San Jose or East LA. The cars are all the same. The job's pretty much the same. The only thing different is learning the geography. In the Park Service, I argue it's in many ways much more complex from the standpoint of the types of things that rangers do and the differences in what rangers are expected to do in different parks based on all kinds of different factors. And I had somebody ask me the other day if I was supportive of this move to rangers going to the 1801 position descriptions. I think it's a total paperwork exercise. Insofar as it helps with, maintaining 6C and that kind of thing, I'm supportive. In relationship to the jobs they're going to do on the ground, this particular ranger was talking about, are they going to be able to be more specialized in law enforcement? I've got news for the law enforcement rangers out there. If we start continuing to migrate towards pure specialization in law enforcement, there will be much, much fewer law enforcement rangers in this organization. And so while, a lot of them are doing a lot of law enforcement, we have a lot of areas where law enforcement's one of many duties. And because of the staffing configurations that we have in the organization and the types of jobs that we have that need to be done, really do need to continue to maintain as much diversity as possible in regards, especially to some of these public safety aspects like structure fire, EMS, or law enforcement. And anyone that thinks we're going to migrate solely to a pure ranger law enforcement model should not be shocked, if that were to happen, to see the numbers substantially reduced in the organization from an LE staffing standpoint.
Sure, because someone else has to do the job. I mean, the job, the work goes there, but just the classification series doesn't change what the demands of the park itself are. And I see where you're coming from. One last thing I'd like to bring up is something that you mentioned, in the way I see it, and tell me where I've gone wrong, is that under the present model, the parks are invested in their employees very early on, especially in the permanent side. They generally have had them there as seasonals in the past and invested in their equipment and training and experience. And as a permanent job, they've paid their salaries and sent them to training, and then they've gone on to they paid their bills through FLETC and field training. So if there's an issue with their performance in field training, it's a big problem for the park, because they have a lot invested in that employee, and it's a heartbreak to see them fail out of the system, because they have a lot invested in it. Where in the highway patrol model, and most agencies and most jobs, you go to work, you should be able to do the job first way out, and they sent me the new employee, and they arrive out of the academy, they can't do the job, they're on their way. A lot less drama that way, and actually for the employee, it's a whole lot more clear and a lot more fair as well. Is that, am I wrong?
Well, no, I don't think you're wrong. I don't think our attrition rates out of FTEP are that high. I don't know what they are exactly. They didn't used to be substantially high.
I don't think it's the numbers that concern me more than the tragedy and drama involved for the park to lose an employee that's been working for them for quite some time, and for the employee who's been working for a number of years to finally get to a point where I have to take a test now, a few years into my career, and I discontinue, as opposed to, well, I've been here for 6 months and I've lost my job, or I've lost an employee after 6 months, versus I've lost an employee after a few years.
Yeah, no, and I think you described the flaw in the system. I mean, you have a seasonal working in a park, and many times years, like you said, in many cases they're getting superior, exceptional performance evaluations multiple seasons over, and then presto, they become permanent and they go to FLETC, and then they get evaluated and they get they don't make it. I think that's a fundamental flaw with our system. And I think that's another reason why we've got to do a better job up front with not having people wait around for years and years and years to go to FLETC and go to FTEP, and do as much as we can to cover that, whether you're seasonal or permanent, to the best degree possible up front, and then making sure we've got the appropriate bridge, in a case where someone is seasonal for years and moves to permanent. But, I mean, all the points that you bring up are very valid and are resultant in the structure that we've created in this agency over decades. And so, I do think that, to your point about centralization, I would call it maybe hybrid centralization, that there's a better way to do that and to catch those issues early on, so you don't have someone working for 5 years in good stead with high performance evaluations, and then, in year 6 they get permanent and get told that they're no longer employed. And so those are, that's a good description of why we need to do better up front in a variety of different areas. Once again, I don't lose sight of the progress that we've made as an organization in advancing, like I said, our policies, our training, our equipment. We've got an incredible group of Rangers working in this organization, special agents. I think we would all agree we can do better. There's been, as much progress has been made. A lot of progress continues to need to be made in many of these key areas, and we're not going to be able to push a button and get everything perfect. But my hope is that we continue to evolve substantially as we move forward, that we understand the structure of this organization, and the law enforcement Rangers especially has evolved over time. It's not going to be fixed overnight, but there are some very obvious things that we've discussed today that I think those may not be the exact answers what we talked about, but some variation can improve or can continue to improve how we hire people, how we're treating folks, the quality of training that we're providing them, and that we're working toward a much more consistent approach to every aspect of this incredible profession, and then from recruitment to retention to you name it. We've got a lot of work in front of us, and I think that it's worthwhile and it's very noble to focus on moving forward.
Cam Sholly, Superintendent, Yellowstone National Park. How do you like the way that sounds, by the way?
It's a great park. I've really enjoyed my last assignments in the Park Service. I've really enjoyed the time in Omaha as regional director. Really enjoyed the associate director assignment in D.C. And Yellowstone's been a great 7 months. Great team up there, great team of partners, a lot of good things going on, and so it's a privilege. But good talking to you here today, Greg.
Thanks for being with me today, Cam. Well, campers, that's all for now. Check back for new shows every few days. Breaking news comes out when it happens on Twitter and Facebook. Thanks for listening. And in case you haven't figured it out, NPS Ranger News isn't affiliated with the government. I'm Greg Jackson for NPS Ranger News. See you on the trail.